What's up, Patriots? Welcome back to the Progressive Playbook. I'm your humble dealer, and for the last few videos, we've been talking about Medicare for All, a single-payer healthcare system where we call upon the government to efficiently cover everyone's basic healthcare costs from doctors who are taking care of our health. Now I want to look at another system where we call upon the government to regulate pharmaceutical companies to get us safe and effective drugs to the citizens. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, has a reputation for being one of the strictest health agencies in the world. And coming from the medical devices industry, I have an idea of how tough it is to get approval for a new product. I can only imagine how it feels working for a pharma company where the regulations are even stricter. Of all the drugs being created, 1 in 1,000 may make it past preclinical trials, and after that, 90% will fail the clinical trials. For the drugs that make it to the end, the whole process from concept to creation will take about 10 to 15 years and will cost $1 billion. It's a really challenging process, but also I wouldn't have it any other way. When we're talking about products that are going inside a human, we really want to make sure these things are safe and effective for us to use. So the general setup for most of the FDA's history has been taxpayer money funds the FDA, which regulates private pharmaceutical companies. Since their funding comes from the public, their job is to serve the public. But due to the increasing fear of the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, activists were putting a lot of pressure on the FDA to get these HIV drugs studied and approved faster. So since 1992, the FDA has been allowed to collect money from pharma companies to help expand their staff and accelerate drug approvals. And this isn't just supplemental money. This is 45% of the FDA's budget. So when nearly half of the FDA's funding is coming from the industry it's supposed to regulate, that presents a clear conflict of interest that is bound to affect operations. This move did accelerate the approval process, but it also seems to have led to more adverse drug reactions that result in hospitalization or death. Under this accelerated approval, pharma companies have to submit extra post-market monitoring data to show their drug is safe and effective. But a lot of times these companies drag their feet in conducting these studies. A report found that 42% of the time, they hadn't started these studies within the first year. Some of them haven't even started after 10 years. And while they're dragging their feet, they're making billions of dollars in profit, totally eclipsing the $2 to $3 million they paid to accelerate the approval process. Not only that, they end up hiking up their prices anyway, more so than the non-accelerated drugs. And sure, more drugs are getting out into the market faster, but these aren't necessarily new, life-saving drugs as initially intended. Pharma companies will opt to make Me Too drugs that are essentially copycats of existing drugs with minor tweaks to the chemistry, but otherwise the roadway to success and profit have already been paved by a previously approved drug. When we're talking about government policy that helps the vast majority of people, critics have no problem asking, oh, are we going to pay for it? But I think when we leave things up to corporations, we ought to ask, where's the innovation? Sometimes there may be benefits to a slightly different or improved drug, but plenty of times we aren't any better off than what we had in the past. It's just a cash cow to keep the company profits running, very much like Disney remakes. But here's the thing, the FDA should be agnostic in whether a pharma company succeeds or fails. Its job is to regulate. But when nearly half of its budget is coming from these companies, it may have a vested interest in keeping these companies afloat to keep its cash cows running. For example, the drug Exondys 51 was designed to treat patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy and was given accelerated approval by the director of the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation Research, despite her own staff and an external advisory committee advising against it. Because the data wasn't strong enough, there wasn't clinical evidence of improvement. Sarepta Therapeutics sold the drug for $300,000 a year, and an FDA internal memo later showed that the director was worried that if the drug didn't go through, Sarepta wouldn't survive. That should not be the concern of an FDA regulator. Okay, so that's a case where an expensive drug was approved before we see its clinical usefulness, but what about cases where it costs us money and lives? Look no further than Vioxx, a drug that was supposed to be like a better version of ibuprofen, but instead ended up giving people heart attacks and strokes. This was evident even in Merck's first study after receiving accelerated approval. Merck downplayed the data, showing 4 times as many cardiovascular events compared to an older pain reliever drug. The FDA called it out too. They sent a warning letter saying, hey, this is misleading, but they didn't withdraw Vioxx, nor did they issue a black box warning. The best they could do was negotiate with Merck, like, hey, can you please put a warning label on this, which Merck did do 2 years after they published that study. Many other studies came out also showing increased cardiovascular events. One of the study leaders, Dr. David Graham from the FDA, submitted the data to senior management and was basically threatened into revising his conclusions. Finally, Merck withdraws Vioxx from the market 5 years after launch. Merck paid about $6 billion in legal settlements and criminal fines, but the drug made them $10.5 billion in profit, so it's still a net win for them. Neither Merck nor the FDA admitted wrongdoing, and nobody went to jail. Meanwhile, 60,000 Americans died, which is around how many Americans died in the Vietnam War. At the time, Vioxx was seen as the biggest pharmaceutical-related catastrophe the world had ever seen. In a hearing, Dr. Graham stated that the FDA, as currently configured, is incapable of protecting Americans against another Vioxx. This came to fruition with the opioid crisis, and just like with Vioxx, a lot of the blame should fall on the shady tactics of the pharma companies who, in this case, told doctors that addiction was rare and that long-term use is safe and effective. But the studies they use to show this are whack, man. You know what they do? They get all subjects physiologically dependent on the opioid for 4 to 6 weeks before the start of the study. So if you didn't tolerate the opioid in those 4 to 6 weeks, you're out of the study. So guess what happens when you only keep the people who tolerated the opioid? During the actual study, it's going to look like they're fine in the long run. But you know where this sort of bogus study comes from? Closed-door discussions between the FDA and pharma company execs. The FDA also had an advisory committee meeting of 10 outside experts to discuss narrowing the labels of these opioids to be used only when the patient is in extreme pain, in which case the benefits outweigh the risks. 8 of these 10 people had ties to the pharma industry, including Purdue, the company that kicked off the opioid frenzy with their oxycodone. So surprise, surprise, they advised against narrowing the label, and after 10 years, doctors had prescribed enough opioids to give every adult in the country a full bottle. The 2 principal FDA reviewers who approved Purdue's application both took positions in Purdue Pharma after leaving the FDA. This opioid epidemic led to an even bigger wave with fentanyl, an opioid that is cheap to make and 50 times stronger than heroin. Not only were US pharma companies making it, companies in China were flooding the US with illegal fentanyl, plenty of times laced in other products that nobody was even aware of. Since the epidemic began, 560,000 Americans have died of opioid overdose, which is like 9 Vietnams. With fentanyl, we're now at a death rate of 1 Vietnam War per year. My thought on all this is the FDA should not be buddy-buddy with the pharma companies. They should not have aligned interests. If anything, the FDA should be more than a regulator, it should be an enforcer. So I think we can do these 3 things. 1 is we should give the FDA the power to demand post-marketing studies and changes to labels in a timely manner, with the authority to charge companies that fail to comply. 2 is we should set rules preventing FDA employees from later going and working with pharma companies. And 3, we should go back to a fully tax-funded model, but keep the same budget to keep the review times from slowing down. So that's an additional $3 billion a year, which is how much they were planning to increase the military budget this year anyway. You know, I'm okay with that extra money not going towards genocides around the world. I'd rather spend that money to protect thousands of lives from harmful drugs. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out the next one where we'll discuss food policies, the F part of the FDA. And if you trust my voice on this platform, be sure to hit me with that LSB, like, subscribe, and bell, and I'll deal you the next one.